We don't have very long for this. A discussion, what is great art? That could take forever. Luckily, we're limited to only 45 minutes. And though I don't think we'll answer the question, I'm sure it'll be an interesting discussion. Before I say anything more, and before I forget, I just wanted to promote my latest project with a colleague, Niall Crowley, and a few other friends, Arts First podcast. If you haven't picked up on it yet, do check it out. We've only done 7 episodes so far. I've been going for about 4 months, but there'll be a lot more coming, and there's loads. As I was just saying here, there's so many different things to say about the arts, and so many different interesting people to talk about the arts that I'm sure you'll enjoy the podcast. So today we're talking about great art, as I said, and what it is. I've got 3 great people to introduce the discussion. First is Ella Nixon, and she initiated the idea, rather bravely, I feel. And she does a PhD in art history in Northumbria University and is on the representation of women artists in regional galleries, which sounds pretty interesting. Angelica Walker-Werth is a writer, editor, and program manager. And I think your main interest is in music, is that right?
Literature.
Literature, it's literature, okay.
I can't talk about music for anything. Yeah, literature and film, there you go.
Yes, film, that's right, yes. And then Dido Powell, who's a painter and a lecturer and tutor in art history. And she does really some wonderful art, so you should check her out online and maybe buy some of her work. Little plug. So I think we'll just go straight into it. Do you want to get started, Ella?
Okay. So great artists they take a woman and they make her mindless, docile, a fantasy. The artist uses, abuses her as a muse, and then distills her essence for award on paper, on canvas, with stone. Gauguin, was Teomana really available as a model? Renoir, did you really paint with your prick to mark the unobscured canvas? Great art is an exploration of the most extreme emotions and scenarios. Life lived by the artist precariously, intensely, with cost. Burn out, but first burn bright. Is great art the history of suffering? Does our experience of great art necessitate the artist's sublimation of their own pain or the pain of others? Great art is a search for visual language that can describe these extreme and seemingly inexpressible emotions. In 1954, art historian Bernard Denver published an article in the Daily Herald entitled "Women Can't Paint." He explained the reason behind this statement. Quote, "The trouble is, of course, that to women art is a hobby, like embroidery or bridge. Only more exciting. To most men who paint, art is a job, like selling insurance or driving a bus. They have to live by it. Living by something and risking losing everything is a sacrifice. Unfortunately, I cannot pass judgment on whether the same applies for bridge, a game which was so rudely dismissed by Denver. But if the history of art has taught us anything, is that creation is a leap of faith to something higher. Authors occupy the same role. Ernest Hemingway allegedly wrote, 'There is nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed.' Authors, like visual artists, dedicate themselves to capturing the human experience. Great art is suffering, and it is a luxury to linger long enough on the page to capture blood on a page or canvas. I know what you're thinking. How is suffering a luxury? Take Dostoevsky, for example, another great. He faced a death sentence, spent time in a Siberian prison, suffered chronic epilepsy, grieved for the death of his children, battled a gambling addiction and manic depression. Yet his incomparable experiences inform many of his novels' most powerful scenes. Paradox fuels great art, darkness alchemized into bright creativity. This takes time, patience, and selfishness. Writing was Dostoevsky's means of resisting oppression. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov cries out in critique of socialism. They believe that a social system that has come out of some mathematical brain is going to organize all humanity at once and make it just and sinless in an instant, quicker than any living process. The living soul demands life. The soul won't obey the rules of mechanics. The soul is an object of suspicion. The soul is retrograde. Dostoevsky pits the living nature of the soul, including its sinful or retrograde nature, against the ideological system that, in promising to make society just and sinless, will kill life itself. That leads us to the next question. Should we dismiss the notion of great art in pursuit of just and sinless or moral art? Postmodernists think so. Art historian Griselda Pollock, who applies Marxist and structuralist theories to advocate for creative equity and gender and race inclusiveness in museums and art, sounds fun, defines the canon, the ordering system of great art as, quote, and you're going to have to bear with me for this is a heavy quote, a discursive formation which constitutes the object's text it selects as a product of artistic mastery and therefore contributes to the legitimation of white masculinity's exclusive identification with creativity and with culture. Taste, according to Pollock, can be manufactured to correct for inequity, much like the mathematical brain described by Dostoevsky, which kills life itself. Ideological art claims to pursue moral good. This is nothing new. Theorists in Victorian England believed that art could have a didactic function. Regional galleries could instruct laymen about proper behaviour. By refusing the great label, are we simply trying to regulate behaviour rather than taking a leap to ignite the human soul? I went to Frieze Art Fair last week. Much like a vegan has to tell you that they're vegan, people who are in the art world must tell you at least once every day in the month of October that they went to Frieze. For those who don't know, Frieze is an annual art fair held in Regent's Park, and it was described in The Spectator as, quote, a spectator sport where leggy blondes eye at wealthy collectors on the make. Alas, no wealthy collectors came my way. My legs aren't long enough. But on the way to Frieze, I did go to Frieze, I noticed a poster at the entrance that declared endless good art. Endless good art. Ideological art can be good. Teach one to be good, depending on ever-changing fashions of what it means to be good. But great art is thrilling, unpredictable. It illuminates the darkness and light of the living soul. Good art endlessly comes and dies, but great art is the painful process of becoming.
To begin our discussion about what great art is, I think we need to first think about what art does for us. What is the purpose of art in our lives? Ella mentioned that art is reaching for something higher. I think it is a way in which we are able to experience that which is most important to us in front of us, whether that's in visual arts or music, which I said I wouldn't talk about, or literature. Now, we need the concept to distinguish work which does that, work which shows us what matters, what's really important, from decoration, which can be beautiful, but doesn't have that thematic value. Or journalism or history, which show us some things that are important, but by reproducing the facts or sharing the facts rather than creating something new, rather than having the selectivity of the artist. We also need to separate art from nonsense. And if you've been in a modern art gallery recently, I'm sorry, it's there. From the actual trash that a janitor correctly identified as such and threw away, to smears on canvases. This is not art. Art is so vitally important to us, we have to separate it from that sort of thing. So, to offer a positive definition, I think that art is a selective recreation of reality, in which the artist emphasizes what he or she thinks is important, what he or she thinks matters. It is necessarily selective, whether you're talking about every brushstroke on a painting, or every note in a symphony, or every word that an author writes. He or she chooses it. Necessarily, they choose. And good art does so in a way that condenses and illuminates things that are important, things that are valuable, things that may be positive or negative. You mentioned suffering. Suffering could be one of them. But things that are potentially universal, Not that literally everyone has experienced them, but everyone could experience them in the abstract. I'm not talking about the specific context here. So for example, I'm a huge fantasy fan. I love Lord of the Rings. I don't connect to the characters in the Fellowship because I too have taken a ring to Mordor. I connect with the characters because I too have faced challenges that felt insurmountable. Because I too have found friends with whom I shared a common goal and with whom I went through hardships. Because I share the view that there is something good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. There are a couple of ways we can evaluate art in a way that is not just, oh, it's subjective. First, there is objectively identifying what the values there are in art. And again, this is why we have to separate out art from nonsense. What is the thing saying? And this does not have to be in a pedantic, ideological way. It can be subtler, and indeed I think should be subtler than that. We can also assess the skills of an artist, and this is where the value of the art critic comes in. He or she has much more knowledge than the average person ever could hope to have. This is the value of expertise. Then there's the personal. We mustn't set aside the emotional resonance, but we should seek to understand it and seek what values are setting off that emotional resonance in us, whether it's positive or negative. Of course, everyone will have their own associations with art because of memories, because of your background, because of your relationships, because of what makes you unique. But this is not, I think, part of evaluating art. It's simply part of enjoying it. So great art, I would argue, depicts universal experiences, condensed truths, and deep values, ideally with remarkable skill in an original and perhaps creative way. In terms of who gets to decide those standards, as I mentioned briefly, I argued that the art critic or historian has a role to play in their knowledge of the skill and the context of the artist. But art should be able to stand on its own such that a thoughtful viewer or reader or listener could appreciate it. It is fine for an artist to ask his or her audience to think, but it is not the same thing for an artist to ask his or her audience to have an entire library's worth of knowledge at their beck and call. Art is way too important for that. Art is something that we all need, and that is why great art truly matters.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, Dido.
Okay, I'm going to narrow it right down and base it on a quote by Baudelaire, where he put forward ideas that he hoped artists of his day would respond to on how to celebrate modernity whilst capturing something that would be eternal, balance the past and the present. In other words, don't produce trite works, but find a method of producing art that would endure and be eternal. He said artists should aspire to extract from fashion whatever element it may contain of poetry within history, to distill the eternal from the transitory. I'm just going to take one example and talk about how these two elements, the eternal and the transitory, could be represented in art, and what was understood by the eternal. I'm going to discuss Manet's painting of the bar at the Folies Bergère, and next to it is Christ's Baptisms of Christ by Piero della Francesca. And Manet is normally discussed in terms of modernism and is rarely the idea of Renaissance balance and harmony, and the canon is not usually applied to Manet. So one of my themes is good art often is based on duality. It's sometimes full of paradox. It's full of things that are mysterious and don't spell out a meaning, so you go back to them. You go back to the work to gather more from it. Just as Turner said, and Constable, you don't use one drawing more than once. You've got to have a new frame of mind. So, structure. The structure of this painting is based on horizontals and verticals in balance with a few circles. And you've got repeated horizontals and you've got verticals. And then in the center you have a figure. And the figure is looking out straight at you, just as in the Piero della Francesca painting, the figure of Christ is looking out at you. Now, the geometric structure, based around balance and harmony and proportion, goes back to Greece, to the beginning of the canon in Hellenistic sculpture, through architecture, written about by Vitruvius, then by Alberti, based on harmonious balances between these very basic geometric shapes. And those basic geometric shapes can give an image a certain order that can give it that eternal feeling. This was something Cézanne also thought about when Impressionists were painting moments. He wanted to get back some structure into his paintings so that they too would exist on a par with paintings in the Louvre, with classical paintings. The other side is the transitory. How did Manet depict the transitory? And I'm also going to argue that even in Renaissance times, those qualities had been explored as well. So the transitory is all to do with the subject. It's a bar, and there's constant movement in the background. And it's a complicated painting because you've got different styles. So you have the stability in the structure, in the centrally placed figure, in the position of a Christ looking out, but the bar is made up out of dabs of paint, daubs, smears, smoky-looking shapes, and that captures the feeling of the Folie Bergère, and that is the quality that captures the moment and the transitory world and something happening in the here and now. But still, those smears and smudges, you can go back to Leonardo, you can go back to the Mona Lisa. It's a double image in some ways. The sexuality of the figure is not completely clear, partly male, partly female. The shapes around the eyes are inverted so that the shadow under the eye is almost like the shape above the eye. And then most of all, Leonardo was famous for his scumbled, rubbed drawings, where he emphasized that if you stick to one line, you're restricting the drawing, you're not allowing it to grow, you're not showing your thoughts, and you're closing down potential. So you have those two aspects. Also, this fast technique is a way of being fleeting. Now, Baudelaire added a third thing. Imagination is what brings these two together, brings the transitory and brings the eternal. And that imagination is then what the artist brings to it. And their imagination is fed by their training and by the concept of improvement and working on the discoveries of others, so innovation. So Michelangelo went to study Masaccio's images. Cubism, is on moving on from Cézanne. So imagination is what would bring these together, and the imagination is also what will fight against the restriction of a canon that is lazily stuck to and repeated, that will produce cliched images. The canon is only something to feed off from and bounce forward, and that notion of progression goes right back to the early Renaissance.
So there's quite a lot to talk about, and I think this the panel was very interesting because they brought a number of different elements to bear in relation to the discussion about great art, and to do, mixing together, on the one hand, the principles and the aspiration for doing something great. I really enjoyed what you said, because you tend to I'm obviously a lot older than you. You tend to want to dismiss young people for being non-judgmental, but one of the things I quite liked about you is the way you're both promoting the idea of judgment. Anyway, we can discuss that. But one of the things I'd quite like to do, if I'm not going to lay this down as law, but I do think that what Dido was doing was something a little bit different, which is sort of like really talking about art as something that she knows obviously a lot about, but takes a lot of pleasure from. So when you are making your contributions, and this isn't to stop anybody who doesn't want to do this, but when you're making a contribution, it'd be great if you could talk about a work, or frame it in terms of a work of art that you feel has really stirred you. It could be anything. It could be music, film, painting, anything. Just sort of like to, like kind of in a way bring it down to earth a bit, if that's the right term, just so that the discussion does cover the principles, that's great, of what you think great art is, but also the reality of what you feel when you've experienced great art yourself, in any form that takes. So, have I put everybody off? Hope not. Anybody like to say something? Ooh, I have put everybody off. Okay, yes, there's somebody at the back, yes. Yeah. Can you speak right up as well?
To the Lighthouse is something I really love by Virginia Woolf, and I love how to me it's very experimental, because halfway through, sorry about the spoiler, but the protagonist dies, and it's just the reaction to it and exploring that, and it's just so sudden, and I don't see that a lot where writers or artists just go against like all your expectations and that element of surprise, and I think it's just taking us out every day and just thinking about things a bit more and just challenging how we go about things or how we approach things as artists. I think that's quite incredible.
And then yes, next you. Yeah.
Hannah Arendt talks about what constitutes a work of art in that essay on the permanence of the world and the work of art, which is part of the Human Condition book. She sort of says that endurance or durability is a key feature of art in society, its capacity to endure. And while I really agreed with what you were saying, Dido, about content being about transitory and the permanent and the imagination, I think stepping back from it to say what is great art as opposed to what's the content of great art, I think that point she makes, that it's in its durability, its capacity to not be used up by the world, not be consumed by the world and still exist in the world, is a really interesting one, and I'd be interested to see what you as the panel think about that. She also says a work of art is a thought object. It's not a feeling object, it's a thought object, so I'd be interested in what you think about that stuff.
Yes, then at that we'll then work our way forward, yeah.
Okay, so just in relation to what's just been said, one of the artworks which I love is Boy with a Knapsack by Kazimir Malevich, which is it's basically two shapes. It's a square and an off square placed on top of each other, and it comes out of a really long development in his art, where he started out in a classical kind of figurative format and went through an evolution of very abstracted art and ended up back in figurative form. And the interesting thing about it is that if you ask most people what is it, they'll kind of have a bit of a something about it. And even until you know what it's called, it isn't necessarily obvious what it is, but everybody can see there is something in it. And to me, that is an example of something which will have durability. But then the question of durability is something I think is a little bit complicated, because we forget. Society doesn't necessarily get to see this stuff all the time. So it might endure, but unless you rediscover it, it's gone.
Yeah. Okay, yes, the volunteer at the back, yes?
Just bouncing off those two previous points, I think perhaps great art has a sort of commonality that I guess a layperson, but as well, experts in art can just look at, just be intrigued in the way the previous gentleman has sort of described, and thus maybe that is what gives it the durability which Lady was talking about.
Yes.
So on musicians, so slightly...
Can everybody hear at the back?
Sorry, I'm a musician, and so is my husband, so we talk quite a lot about music. But a lot of people used to say talking about music is like dancing about architecture. You know, and he's very much like, if I talk about it too much, I lose it. And I'm not actually classically trained. It was always something that I picked up by ear and I was intuitively doing. And I find with music, if I try and analyse it too much, I'm not interested in what critics have to say, actually. In fact, they just wind me up because it's kind of like, well, I'd rather hear it for myself. And sometimes it's hard to pinpoint or even describe. It's a feeling. And someone else can take that same song and do something completely entirely different with it. And I'll hear that and go, nah. And I don't even quite know what it is, why that interpretation of it isn't doing it. But it just isn't. And sometimes I'm quite happy with not actually being able to explain that, and it is something more, someone said it's more about thinking and feeling. With music, I'm the opposite. I think it's much more about feeling and thinking. And for all the analysis and talking about it, sometimes you connect with an authenticity or a performance, which in itself can't be replicated almost. It's just in that moment. So that's, anyway, that's...
So is somebody with you? Yes.
No.
Yeah, that's you.
So I'll phrase this as a question. Can you separate the appreciation or evaluation of the technical qualities from the moral theme of the work? Examples would be Game of Thrones. Horrendous moral theme, excellent cinematography. Another one is Rage Against the Machine. Tom Morello's an incredible guitarist, but the music is full of awful ideas. Like, can you treat those separately, appreciate one without the other?
Excellent question, yes. Yes, you want to see? And then I had somebody at the back here, but yeah. You first, man, again.
Okay, I might be contentious here, but one of the greatest works of art, in my opinion, is Jackson Pollock's Convergence, 1952. It's not representational. You know, how do you describe it? It's obviously, as you were talking about, this sense of feeling, and it doesn't reproduce well. You buy a postcard of it, you're not going to get the experience of seeing it when unless you go to New York to go and see it in the flesh, so to speak. So it reveals something about the unconscious, the collective unconscious, it dances, it flows, it's ultimate freedom in a sense. And I think it's a beautiful piece of work, but people may just go, I don't get that, my child can do that, which is, I think, a bit crass, so I'm going to defend Jackson Pollock and see what the balance is.
Very good, yes. Yes, there, yeah. And then we'll come back to the panel after Shirley speaks, so maybe, and very brief comments, and then go out again, so, yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, you sorry, I've got your name. Zayda started out her talk alluding to the trend at the moment, as I see it, of a real attack on a lot of what we would see as great art through disparaging the artists themselves. And I wondered if you might want to say, do you see that as a serious problem that we've got to face, or is it just something, one of these fashionable things that's in passing? I have to say, it puts me off going to a lot of galleries these days because of what decisions are being made for me about how I should judge a work of art.
Okay, what shall we start off? Dido, do you want to start off, or is that...
Well, I totally agree with the statement about Jackson Pollock. He's very brilliant, and he's an example of his work definitely is stuff you have to see in the flesh, and maybe it's similar to a photograph of a landscape. You see a wonderful landscape, you want to capture that marvelous feeling, your photo doesn't give you anything back. And so Pollock's paintings, yes, you're completely immersed in it, and I'd say they are very layered, and you feel all the different stages and the vigor of the way the paint has been put on. So they have a lot of history in them, encrusted in the surfaces.
Okay,
so yes, they're great art.
Okay.
I disagree about Pollock, but I haven't time to respond. Just wanted to have that out there. I wanted to start with a thought versus feeling object, because I think that's a very interesting discussion, and I would suggest that it's both. I think art is both an object of thought and feeling. Your discussion about music pointed out that when sometimes you focus too much on the analysis, you focus too much on the technique, you forget to feel it. And that's absolutely a problem. But if we only feel things and we don't think about them, I think also sometimes we lose things. Again, music is not my expertise. I have a colleague who focuses on that. But to put it into the world of painting, the most valuable thing I learned to do to appreciate a work of art was to look at the story of that painting, to understand what was going on in that painting, which you cannot do with a Pollock, and therefore to be able to feel it. There are both elements involved. The thinking should augment the feeling, and the feeling augment the thinking. This is actually the purpose of my personal project now, if I may. I write about the philosophic ideas in fiction, and the point is, I enjoy that there's this whole book talk phenomenon right now where people talk about books on social media, but 90% of it is just, oh, that book had great vibes, that book was fun. Like, it's so surface level, and if you don't lose anything by going just a few steps below that. You turn it into a thought object and not only a feeling object.
I guess I'll start by saying you have great taste. The examples, I like Jackson Pollock. And also to the lighthouse as well. I'm going to kind of wind round to get back to the question about, whether we can separate the art from the artist through this way, but bear with me for now. So To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf is extremely lyrical. It's a beautiful piece of writing in itself, but the way that book works is through stereotypes. And I think stereotypes are a very important aspect of great art, because stereotypes kind of, by having these quite extreme characters in artworks, we kind of evaluate our own characters ourselves. It was E.M. Forster in Aspects of a Novel who talked about how novels should be structured. We should have stereotypes, but then more complex, rounded characters. And it's those complex characters that we can kind of make sense with by balancing these stereotypes. And I think this kind of comes back to the question about whether we can separate art from the artist, because like I was saying in my speech, in great art is, it contains many extremes. It contains many extreme characters. Some of them are incredibly dislikable, but that's interesting, right? We love gossip as humans, so I prefer to kind of hear more interesting stories. And then, as the quote from Dostoevsky, when I was talking about the living soul, that kind of sparking of the living soul, I think it's important to not shy away from that, but just know that by, have faith in our own, how we behave as humans, don't return to that didactic kind of regional art gallery role that I spelled out of like a morality. We can ignite our own soul and decide which parts we take on.
Great. Okay. We've only got a few minutes left, so I invite as many comments as I can fit in that time. Do you want to put your hands up? Oh, yeah, there's somebody there. And put your hands up and have a look. See how short I... Yeah. Yes, you go, Pierre. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the role of thinking about bad art in how we constitute this question. So I was quite surprised to hear kind of the opposite of your opinions. Dido, I expected you to be the traditional speaker who said that 1890 was great. Actually, the young art historians who want the last 50 years to disappear. And from that perspective, from that perspective, when do we feel, if we do indeed feel, that somehow we started producing more bad art than we used to art historically? And is it simply a bias of availability?
Yeah. Yes, you, and then there's, I think you were somebody there? Anyway, you first, and put up your hands up again, go on.
Okay, so these are just some words about what art means to me,
right.
What can mean to many people, no matter whether it's film or painting and so on. But art is an opportunity to bring us closer to divinity, to give us spiritual reach, to fulfill fantasies. It's a distraction from daily toil. It's an opportunity to inspire us to fulfill dreams.
Very good. Yeah, very nice. Okay, anybody else? Feel free to answer any questions that have been asked that you feel you've got a possible answer to. Like, is there a problem with bad art? I'll ask. And the other question I loved actually was the one about, technical brilliance versus moral decrepitude.
I'm kind of struggling with the durability question, and I'm asking it not because I don't know what the answer is. Because if you look at a lot of contemporary art practice and architecture as well, and it kind of elevates the transitory, which is almost why I kind of asked this question. I think also the thought object is not to do with the consumption, it's to do with the production of the art. And it seems to me that a lot of contemporary art isn't really art, it's just entertainment. A lot of the stuff that I see, particularly in China, it's just about taking people through a set of experiences as a consumer, using film and light, and a lot of art galleries are now filled with this. But I'm conscious of the fact that I might be writing off something that's actually quite an important piece of work, so I'm still struggling with this idea about durability.
Yeah. Anybody else? Everybody completely yes?
I guess I just wondered about the panel's view about, I guess the soul has been mentioned and eternity, and how much a secular society, or even not like a piece of art which struggles with this, kind of things like grace and sin and human suffering, how much that's not being thought about or shunned, and how that is affecting art.
Yeah. Anybody else? I'm going to get my speakers to wind up, yes?
I quite like some of the things that people are struggling with in terms of thinking, feeling, the thought object. I think it's important to think that when an object makes you feel in such a way that you have to think about it, that's the birth of criticism, right? So, and the durability of artworks for me, the ones that are durable, that endure through centuries, right, are the ones that keep unpacking the importance of a moment in their time in a way that still is available to you to have to think about your own feeling. So, and that's why it's also important that we don't dismiss the art of every particular epoch. Right? I think to be a Renaissance person, to be an enlightened person, to work on one's own intelligence and sensitivity and knowledge of the world and its history and our world, is to discover what's good about everything, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, of 2,000 years of people making things that made them think about where they felt. So I think it's, Jackson Pollock, yes. Anthony Caro is one of my faves. He's an abstract sculptor, and he tells you things about space and body and stillness and activity, which other kinds of work do not do. The important things about the innovations of human beings and how they discover new things to think and feel about.
All right, panel, shall we start if we could go in the same direction? Yeah, so Ellie first.
I guess I just correct that the bad art comment in terms of contemporary art. I'm a big fan of contemporary art. And I'm gonna mention Frieze again. Frieze was a great example of very good contemporary art, I thought, at the moment, and it gave me a lot of faith. Actually, there was some great, return to figuration in painting, and some of the works there, and this is kind of addresses a question about entertainment. Some artworks can just be fun. Like, I think we can't forget that. Like, life can be mundane day to day, but to just go somewhere and see, have a fun experience. Like, maybe that's not great art, maybe it's not, but also it's fun. It's for the sake of just doing something that's quite playful. Just to address the durability question, I guess that's why in my speech I was addressing the idea of suffering, because suffering is, a universal human experience, and maybe that can feed into the, question about secularism. It's a theme that unites us all, and it's very difficult to think about suffering. So that's one way that great art could be quite durable. And finally, to talk about quality as well. It just reminded me of a quote by Harold Bloom, who said about the quality of a work, you wouldn't buy a table from a carpenter if the leg fell off, for example. And I think a problem with some contemporary art now is that it does just kind of break. So when I've talked to technicians who look after these artworks, they say we buy these artworks, but they're just not well made. But they're very ideological, so we can't say no to it. So maybe that's something to think about.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's very funny. But I'm not going to pick up on the contemporary art question. I want to first talk about theme versus execution, and then pick up on your secular soul question. I think you can, and in fact need to, separate the theme of a work from its execution. But I think great art has good of both. And it doesn't need to be like a traditional morality play to have a good theme. It can be just something that celebrates something good. One of my favorite book series I've read recently is about a dragon natural historian, and there's nothing bad or seriously at risk in this book. She's just studying dragons because she loves dragons. It's just positive in that sense. So that can be a theme. But I think we've all experienced a work of art where we can see what the artist was going for, but it didn't land, right? They just didn't, maybe the plot was great, but the dialogue was awkward, or something just wasn't done well, and it just doesn't resonate with you as well. Skill matters. And being well constructed also matters. On the issue of the secular soul, I absolutely think that we as not everyone is non-religious, of course, but I am, and I think a lot of the people who are not religious are afraid of the soul, are afraid of the higher concepts, are afraid of reverence. And we're losing so much by being afraid of those things. I don't think the soul is anything mystic, but that doesn't mean it's not important. I don't think that reverence has to be for God, but that doesn't mean it's not important. These things are vital to flourishing, and we have to learn how to do that better, I think, in art.
Mm-hmm. And Dido.
I'm also not religious. I think an effect of awe at an enormous work of art recreates a feeling that approaches a type of religiosity. And you can have a sensation that's scale and colour and materials. That scale seems to be very important in that respect. And so you can actually get from certain artworks a feeling combined with a thought, but a feeling that can completely absorb you and take your concentration that would be equivalent to a religious feeling. And somebody like Roscoe hoped that many of his paintings in the right setting would have that sort of impact where you're sucked into the work. Then on the idea of art being badly made and breaking, I just remember a funny thing that when Duchamp's large glass was being transported from one house to another, the glass smashed, and then when he got it, there were all these sheds with shards within the frame, and he left it in the studio for a while and dust settled, and then he finally, after a while, said, "It's finished now. This is really good." So there have been many accidents where art has come about from the accidents. But the other thing I would say is creation and destruction are very close. So Picasso said his works were an act of destruction. You bung in lots of things, and then you sift out and you synthesize and you come down to an essential point. And Pollock said he had to just crush Picasso out of his head in order to be able to create. So destruction and creation are quite close. And also the business of looking back at a picture, I do think curious, not quite mistakes, but oddities can keep you searching for a work. Singer Sargent said a portrait is a picture of a person where there's something wrong about the mouth. And many of the, for example, portraits that we like, there's something slightly wrong. For present day art, I think it's the same as any other period. There's some that's good and there's some that's just dross. It isn't bad because it's contemporary. It isn't bad because it doesn't have a subject we can recognise or it's presented in a form we don't know. It just might not be a very imaginative piece, and that's all, as happened in all centuries.
Okay, thank you very much. I thought that. I have to say, I thought that was a particularly brilliant panel, and I learned a lot from it.